Purpose of this lecture is to describe our community corrections population, give you an idea of, what percentage of people are sitting in each of the categories. Okay, remember there's three parts to the criminal justice system. You have police, courts, and corrections. Community corrections is part of it. It's part of the correction system. So the cops have to collect evidence on you or you're suspected of a crime. It goes through the court system where the district attorney would decide to charge you and then you'd have to be convicted to end up in the correction system. All right. As you'll see in a second, we've had huge growth since the 1980 in our overall correction population. Per 100,000 is the best measure to use. Okay, you don't care about absolute growth because if the size of the population changes, then that number will seem bigger. An example of this would be pretend Hawaii has got 3,000 to 4,000 people incarcerated in prison, and California's got 100,000. What's not those numbers? California has so many more raw numbers simply because it's a bigger state. What you need to know is what's the incarcerate per 100,000 people. Okay, so basically that means if you look, as I'll show you, our corrections population has almost tripled. Okay, nowadays this is the latest data available, time of making this lecture, is that about 3% of the U.S. adult population, or about 1 in every 33 adults, were incarcerated on probation or parole at year-end 2018. Okay, so that's everybody who's in some form of correctional population. So it's very large. Okay. Okay, here's our total correction population. What you can see is even just look at the far right-hand columns. Okay, essentially in 10 years, the size of the people in our correction populations per 100,000 doubles, right? And then it's up 3 times, right? By the next over the next decade, right? So, long story short, that's a dramatic increase in the percentage of our population that we're locking up. Okay, so, well, it's not just locked up. I apologize. This is everybody. Prison, jail, that's called incarceration, being locked up, or probation and parole. All right. So, corrections is big, getting bigger. All right, so what we want to know, we're going to try to describe community corrections here, which are probation and parole. Okay, so they're the two most basic kinds. Okay, probation means you're not initially incarcerated, but you're allowed to go out into the community under a set of conditions, right? So remember, everybody's been convicted of something. If you're on probation, the judge basically says, if you're a good little boy or girl, I'm going to let you out in the community under a set of conditions. If you don't break any of those, you won't have to be incarcerated or locked up. Parole means you were first in prison. Okay, so that means you were convicted of a felony, but then you're let out early into the community under a very similar set of conditions. And, the basic ones are, don't commit any new crimes, meet with your parole or probation officer. They might P-test you, etc., have you look for a job, stay employed, etc. Okay, I'm unaware of any states that allow parole from jail. So generally what it is it's an early release from prison, and you're only in prison for a felony, which is usually 1 year or more. Okay. Other offenses less than felonies, if you are incarcerated, you're sent to jail. So if you look at the next bullet point, you'll see that this has remained pretty constant. I was pretty surprised to see that as I look over time. Is that probation is the largest of all the corrections populations. Okay. Prisons are about 20%, and then jail and parole are each about 10%. So if you add up the people on parole and probation, that's about 70%. So community corrections is about 70% of the overall corrections population, just to give you sort of a feel of where these people are. All right, so let's talk about probation. Probation, again, it's conditional release into the community with rules. We're not going to incarcerate you. Okay? It's the largest part of our correction system by far, as we just looked at. And this sort of gives us an idea of what's going on, right? Prior to 1990, I can't find parole and probation separated, okay? But as we just saw, there's huge growth between the 80s and 90s, right? And then we'll see parole data below, but it's so small. Remember, it's only about 10%, right? It doubles over time, as we'll see. Again, when we looked at that first table, the percent of adults under some form of correctional population doubles from 1980 to 1990. And then again, right? All right. So if we look at just people on probation, we're looking at per 100,000, right? So it doesn't quite double from 80 to 90, right? And then 2000 is sort of the high watermark, 2005-ish, right? And then it seems to be going down. I apologize. I don't, only from 2005 on do I kind of have what those things mean. So you can look at the percentage of adults, and that gives you a clue, right, of how it changes over time. Hawaii, they don't give us per 1 million adults. They just say per residents, right? And so I kind of fake it here, all right? So I said, let's just pretend we had about 1 million adults in the state. I don't know how good that is or not. You know, there's a little bit over 1 million folks, like 1.4, I believe, something like that. So that's just me estimating to give you an idea, right? Little bit, pretty darn similar, right? A little bit higher in 2015 and 18. Yeah, let's look at some of the demographics, right? So a couple takeaways here is that probation, it's overwhelmingly male, right? That's true in all the other aspects of our criminal justice system. That's not surprising. And then you see, so African Americans are overrepresented. African Americans are black. They're about 12 to 15% of the population, depending on the year. But you can see they're almost double that, more closer to 30% of the probation population. That's called overrepresentation. Hispanics are, you know, it depends on the year, roughly 18%. So they're kind of a little bit underrepresented depending on the year. Okay. Okay, let's look at what people are being locked up for. Okay, so the first thing is the seriousness. Felony is the most serious type of crime, right? So you can see how that changes over time. If you look at how we're allowing a lot more, a bigger percentage, right? Essentially goes 55, 52, 50. It almost, you know, from 2000 in 10 years, it kind of doubles. And I'm thinking that what's going on there is our prisons are getting fuller, right? Our corrections population grew tremendously. Prison systems grew the most. So it's very expensive to lock somebody up in prison. It's like $20,000 to $40,000 a year, and that's in 2006. That's the latest Hawaii data I could find. And they're probably getting better at determining risk to the public. And you can see misdemeanor stays pretty, that's the next level, and then you see other things. Okay, and then we can look at, what's more interesting is you look at, well, what kinds of crimes are they going over for? Okay. I want to sort of, one of the things we could look at is, well, geez, they're putting a lot more felony people on probation. That might be worrisome, right? It could be, if they're not dangerous, it could be a good thing, and then it saves us money, right? The whole idea is public safety, right? If you're into that. I mean, I guess you could be willing to pay a huge amount of money just to punish somebody because it feels good, right? I'd preferably only want to lock up people who are a danger to the community. But that's personal preference, right? I have another lecture in another course called "Who Goes to Prison," and this was a really wonderful study of people in prison. It's the best one I've ever seen, and they have both quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative are numbers, qualitative are stories. And what that study suggests is that the people sent to prison don't fit the popular image of sort of the really violent, predatory criminal, if you would, who's a huge danger to society. I think they end up saying that the public would probably be surprised to learn who we are spending our money prison is an expensive resource. People would be surprised to see who we're spending that on. I'll read you the quote from the lecture notes. Most crimes are pettier than the popular images promoted by those who sensationalize the crime issue. More than half of persons sent to prison committed crimes that lacked any of the features that the public believed compose a serious crime. They end up saying the vast majority of people admitted to prison are low-rate offenders who commit petty crimes. Even the high-rate offenders tended to commit very unskilled, unprofitable crimes. Essentially, they argue we're wasting our money and making our crime problem worse in the long run by sending so many people to prison. Okay, they cite some evidence showing that if the public were aware of the true nature of their crimes, most would not suggest prison as a sentence as an appropriate punishment. So remember, we're looking at, well, look, they're allowing more people who commit felonies out in the community. Is that a good or a bad thing, right? They would argue that it was, and here's why. A number of studies have also discovered when respondents are given the scenarios that are closer to the actual crimes of most people sent to prison, the majority of them recommend some punishment other than imprisonment. Collectively, these polls that show that a majority of citizens would not recommend imprisonment for most of the people being sent to prison if they knew more about the offender's crimes and life circumstances. So that would argue that we see an increase in felonies being never incarcerated in the first place could be a good thing. Okay, it's a wonderful. I could lead you to the book, and I might even have a portion of it in PDF form. When we look at the most serious offense over time, okay, remember, if you hurt somebody, that's a violent offense, right? If you steal something, that's property. That's the next seriousness. Drug would maybe be the third most serious. But if you hurt somebody or stole something, you wouldn't be in the drug category, right? So drug offenders are non-violent offenders. Property offenders, they're non-violent. They didn't do any property crimes, okay? So that's important. So drug offenses stay pretty constant, right? Same with property crimes. That's hard to interpret. I'm just going to have some conjecture here for you. Why do violent offenders go down over time? Okay, so remember we had talked about maybe if a lot of the felonies they're not sending them to prison, right? That's at 60% for 2018. Well, it could be that they're sending the violent offenders to prison, but the other ones who are not necessarily a danger to the public, they're not, right? So that's kind of conjecture on my part. Why would violent offenders on parole be going down in relation to other probationers? Right? It's probably they're incarcerating more violent people, but letting out, not choosing to incarcerate the other ones. Okay, so basically less violent offenders are being put on probation. Again, that's my only explanation. I could be wrong. Okay, we'll look at the success rate. Okay, unfortunately, it hasn't been updated due to inconsistencies since 2005. Okay, but basically, here we can see that a little bit over half, about 60% of people complete parole, and a very, very small percentage of those who fail on probation commit a new crime, right? So the new sentence row is what I would personally be worried about. Remember, if we let them out, we don't incarcerate them, we're worried, are they going to use that freedom to commit new crimes, right? So the vast majority of people who do fail are basically not following the rules, right? Meeting with their probation officer, P tests, etc. So that's kind of heartening, right? The idea is that, yeah, we're letting people out on probation. Very, very small percentage of are using that freedom, like, you didn't catch me the first time. Watch me be more criminal, right? So that's heartening. So it looks like the people who are failing are for technical violations, and you can read more about that in the lecture notes. Okay, parole. Okay, remember, that's the supervised release of a defendant from prison, which you're only in prison for a felony. Again, if there's a state that has parole from jail for non-felonies, I'm unaware of it. Okay, but basically you're let out of prison before your sentence is expired, and you sort of promised to be good in the community. Very similar set of conditions as probation, right? Don't commit any new crimes. Get a job if you don't have one. Well, I guess if you got out of prison, you wouldn't have a job, right? But so it'd be look for employment. If they P-test you, have you go to drug treatment, etc., you got to follow those kinds of rules, right? A way to conceptualize it, if you will, it's probation after prison, right? So it's basically early release from prison and you're out in the community. Kind of interesting to look at the parole population over time, right? Yes, it's getting bigger, right? Because remember, we go on incarceration binge from 1980 to especially 2000, 2005, right? So you have to be in prison first to get out on parole, right? So that's why it grows, right? So that sort of gives us a clue there, right? That's probably why it grows. And then as we start to incarcerate less people, then you see it start slightly go down. But that ain't by much, right? These can just be little blips. For Hawaii, again, I couldn't really find it, so I pretended there were 1 million people in the state, adults, right? And say, well, where are we in terms of people on probation, right? So basically less than 1%, right, over time. Okay, demographics, very similar story to that of probation, right? Whites are underrepresented. They're, Hawaii's different, and so is California, but in the West. But in general, I want to say whites are somewhere around 60 and going smaller. Hispanics are somewhere around 15 to 20 and getting bigger. I'm not sure about African American in terms of that changes over time, but whites are underrepresented, African Americans are overrepresented, and Hispanics are kind of right around representation. Okay. Okay, let's look at parole by most serious offense. I could not find numbers for separating by most serious offense for parole until 2005. The good news for me is you see people, drug offenses dropping over time. I think it's a total waste of money to lock people up in a cage for possessing drugs, and it's called a nonviolent offense. So same thing with probation, right? If you're a drug offense, you're a nonviolent offender. If you hurt somebody and got caught with drugs, you're in the violent category. Same with property, right? If you stole something from people and were busted for drugs, you're in the property category, right? So basically, fewer drug-only offenders or nonviolent drug offenders are being sent to prison in the first place, would be my interpretation of that. That's my guess. And then it seems that it's kind of like, why are more violent offenders being out on parole? Again, that might be, this is conjecture on my part, but what's kind of a fun part to do is try to tell the story. One of the ideas is that, we're getting better at sort of, remember I just told you that most people, when you find out the actual offense, most Americans wouldn't recommend prison in the first place. So not all those violent offenses are particularly dangerous offenses. You might go, yeah, they got in a fight and the guy got a black eye. You know what I'm saying? It's like, that's an example. I'm not trying to say all violent offenders in prison are like that. Okay? But it's interesting that they grow. Drug offenders go down, property offenders go down. It could be, again, read the lecture notes for a little bit more detail, and I say this more eloquently. I will say this. One of the cool things when you can sort of look at this, the very last part of the lecture, I think one of the cool page where I talk about successful completion on parole, it's a very similar thing, right? The percentage of people who are failing over time on parole, it's not because they use that newfound freedom to commit a new crime. Some of them do. I'm not saying that. Okay. But the majority of those are more, the majority of those failures are related to the idea that you didn't follow the rules, right? They're called technical violations, right? You didn't meet with your parole officer, you pee tested dirty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So prison's a pretty expensive, it's the most expensive resource we have in our criminal justice. So if you're into efficiency and protecting the public in an efficient manner, doesn't waste tax dollars like I am, then finding ways to lower the incarceration rate would probably be good. Okay. So comparing probation to parole, you'll see about 60% of the people on probation are successful, but it's only about 45% of people who are on parole. Again, remember, you're looking at two different groups of people. It should make sense, right? You went to prison first, so you were, you know, you got caught for a felony. That's why you're in prison and then on parole. So you could be, so to speak, you have a more committed criminal lifestyle. You're more committed to that kind of group. Also, prison is very, despite the idea that, oh, they're all there and they're living all high off the hog, right? Even the guys that are running crap are literally being scared out of their minds deep down, right? And they're living in constant fear of being, having their power taken from them. So it's kind of like the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? It's very, very, very clear that once you get out of prison, you'd have post-traumatic stress, very similar to combat people. Some people get out of combat and have post-traumatic stress disorder. So we would expect them to either have some of that. It's not a nice place. But just remember that the idea that a lot of people sort of learn their lesson or they're scared straight while they're locked up is most likely kind of a stupid thought, meaning that there's not a lot of evidence for it. Remember, you have to, we're looking here is aggregate data, right? So if you may have seen somebody in the media, a story about somebody who, no, it worked for me, right? Or you may know somebody, it may even be yourself. That's what's called an anecdote or anecdotal evidence. And that's a very, very important concept, right? Just because it's true for one person doesn't mean it's true for the group, right? I like to use the analogy of a forest. Just because something is true for an individual tree in the forest doesn't mean that individual tree is representative of the rest of the forest. That's the idea. So we're talking about efficacy, whether or not prison works to reduce some of our crime problem, right? Not about the emotional satisfaction of seeing somebody in prison, which is a different issue, right? I'm into efficiency, so that's sort of like why I'm saying stuff like that. For online, you can ignore the next slide. That would just be an in-person exercise.